Welcome back, dear students, to another session on criticism. I'll be introducing you to the concept of romantic criticism. Here, I present before you the 11th, 12th, and 13th sessions of Module 1 for students of BA 5th SEM, Paper 1, Criticism, prescribed for Karnataka University, Dharwad. I'm Dr. Vichalakshmi Nayak, Assistant Professor, GFGC and PG Center, Dharwad. The first thing to say is that the very term romantic poetry is misleading because it assumes that poets as different as Coleridge and Keats all shared a common agenda. They didn't. Blake's view of language was quite different to Wordsworth's. Blake, in his prophetic books, writes in the hierarchic tradition that wants to protect religious truth from vulgar misunderstanding. In fact, he quotes, "That which can be made explicit to the idiot is not worth my care." That is said by Blake. While Wordsworth writes in the tradition of the plain style, wanting to convey the feelings and notions of rustic life in simple, unelaborated expressions. We also see that Wordsworth's statement of purpose to choose incidents from common life and to relate to describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men. This statement was severely critiqued by many critics. One of the criticisms Burke made of the French Revolution was that it sought to break completely with the past, and that, says Hazlitt, is what the Lake School aspired to do as well. All was to be natural and new. Nothing that was established was to be tolerated. Hazlitt is referring to the way Wordsworth and Coleridge react against the followers of Pope and the old French school of poetry. Now, the most elemental factor in Wordsworth's return to nature was imagination. He referred to imagination as an awful power that reveals with the flash the invisible world. Wordsworth's primary concern is with the language of poetry. Wordsworth's preface is intended to justify the style, subject matter, and language of the poems included in lyrical ballads. But the underlying intention is to make some more general statements which effectively redefine what properly constitutes a poetic language, as well as the nature and scope of the poet. Some of these comments have become classic statements of romantic aesthetic doctrine, sometimes through isolation from their context. Wordsworth is calling for a return to a kind of realism, a descent of poetic language from its stylized status, from its self-created world of metaphorical expression and artificial diction to the language actually used by human beings in common life. He gives the difference between the poet and other men also. According to Wordsworth, the poet is endowed with a more lively sensibility, a greater knowledge of human nature, and a more comprehensive soul. So we see Wordsworth disliked almost all poetic devices, including personification, allusions, hyperbole, inversions, etc. Wordsworth believed that neoclassical form of poetic expression was artificial and the emotions were not spontaneous in neoclassical poetry. Wordsworth was influenced by the folk song and ballad tradition. That is why he uses rustic language and rustic people for his poems. For Wordsworth, poetry was an expression of personal emotions. The emotions are tempered and restrained to suit poetic expression. He believed that poetry aroused sympathy for fellow beings and creatures. It revealed the mysteries of nature. Poetry was not just a tool for moralizing, it gave religious insights into what we see around us. Wordsworth gave insights into the process of poetic creation. He stressed the relationship between the poet and the poem more than the poem and the reader in his theories. Raymond Williams argues that William Blake, Presby Shelley, William Wordsworth, and Coleridge used the art to uphold certain human values, capacities, and energies which they felt industrialization was threatening or even destroying. Blake declares that machines were destructive of humanity and art. Coleridge bemoans political economy and the general contagion of its mechanical philosophy. Now, this hostile attitude to the emerging industrial society may explain two important features of Romantic poetry: its preoccupation with nature and its emphasis on the individual. The process of art is seen as an organic whole. The process of art is seen as organic compared to the mechanical nature of production. John Keats states that if poetry come not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. The romantic idea of the individual is partly a reaction to the idea that only science can know the truth of things, and partly to the growth of mass society, which threaten to absorb the individual into the crowd. Now, coming to one of the greatest critics, Coleridge is one of the greatest of literary critics, and his greatness has been almost universally recognized. He occupies, without doubt, the first place among English literary critics. In fact, after eliminating one after another, the possible contenders for the title of the greatest critic, Sainsbury concludes that there are only three contenders: Aristotle, Longinus, and Coleridge. A man of stupendous learning, both in philosophy and literature, ancient as well as modern, and refined sensibility and penetrating intellect, Coleridge was eminently fitted to the task of a critic. In the field of theoretical inquiry, Coleridge was the first to introduce psychology and philosophy into literary criticism. He was interested in the study of the process of poetic creation, the very principles of creative activity, and for his purposes, he freely drew upon philosophy and psychology. Thus, he made philosophy the basis of literary inquiry and thus brought about a union of philosophy, psychology, and literary criticism. His literary theories have their base in philosophy. He imparted to criticism the dignity which belongs to philosophy. His greatest and most original contribution to literary criticism is his theory of imagination. He is the first critic to differentiate between imagination and fancy, the first literary critic to distinguish between primary and secondary imagination. Through his theory of imagination, he revolutionized the concept of artistic imitation. Poetic imitation is neither a servile copy of nature, nor is it the creation of something entirely new and different from nature. Poetry is not imitation, but it is creation. It is creation based on the sensations and impressions received from the external world. Such impressions are shaped, ordered, modified, and opposites are reconciled and harmonized by the imagination of the poet, and in this way, poetic creation takes place. It was Coleridge who finally, for the first time, resolved the age old problem of the relation between the form and content of poetry. This was said by David Deutsch about Coleridge. Through his philosophical inquiry into the nature and value of poetry, Coleridge established that a poem is an organic whole and that its form is determined by its content and is essential to that content. Thus, meter and rhyme, Coleridge showed, are not merely something superfluous which can be dispensed with. nor mere decoration, but they are essential to that pleasure which is the true poetic pleasure. This demonstration of the organic wholeness of a poem is one of Coleridge's major contributions to literary theory. Similarly, his theory of willing suspension of disbelief marks a significant advance over earlier theories on the subject. His view that during the perusal of a poem or the witnessing of a play, there is neither belief nor disbelief, but a mere suspension of disbelief, is now universally accepted as correct, and the controversy on the subject has finally been set at rest.